For generations, the West has lived under the conviction that its power is permanent, that its systems are too entrenched and too advanced to ever be replaced or seriously threatened. This belief did not emerge by accident. It was built on centuries of economic expansion, military superiority, and technological innovation that allowed a handful of nations to project their influence across the globe. From the financial systems that set the rules of global trade to the cultural exports that shaped lifestyles and aspirations, the West positioned itself as the center of modern civilization. But the illusion of permanence is dangerous. Every empire before thought its dominance unshakable, until history reminded them that no structure, however powerful, can escape the cycle of rise and decline. The West is not immune to the very laws of history it once used to analyze others. The illusion of endless power is reinforced by the global role of its currency, its control of international institutions, and its unmatched military alliances. These pillars have created the sense that Western leadership is inevitable and eternal, but inevitability is an illusion. Power, no matter how strong, decays when it becomes complacent. The very belief that no alternative can challenge the existing system has blinded decision makers to the reality that alternatives are already forming. Just as once the Roman Empire assumed the provinces could not survive without Rome's authority, so too does the West imagine the world cannot function without its leadership. But history shows that once people find alternatives, loyalty to the center evaporates. The financial system tells the clearest story of this illusion. The dominance of one global currency gave Western nations unmatched leverage, allowing them to enforce sanctions, dictate trade flows, and finance their deficits by exporting debt to the rest of the world. This worked as long as trust in the system was absolute. But when trust erodes, when countries realize they can trade energy, commodities, and even technology without routing every transaction through the same financial channels, the once mighty system begins to weaken. The illusion lies in assuming that just because the system has worked for 70 years, it must work forever. That is the same mistake every empire makes. The failure to imagine a world where their power is no longer central. Military alliances provide another layer of false confidence. For decades, the idea that the West held the world's most powerful armies created the assumption that no rival would dare to challenge it directly. This sense of invulnerability shaped policies that were more about maintaining dominance than about building sustainable partnerships. Yet the cost of sustaining global military presence grows heavier with each passing year. While new technologies like cyber warfare, drones, and artificial intelligence make traditional power projection less decisive. Military superiority once meant control, but now it often means overstretch, endless commitments, and fragile supply chains vulnerable to disruption. The illusion is that the same old formula of strength automatically guarantees victory, when in reality, the battlefield has already shifted to domains where sheer force cannot guarantee dominance. Cultural dominance, once perhaps the West's most powerful tool, is also showing its limits. Hollywood, media, fashion, and digital platforms created a narrative of modern life that much of the world adopted. Yet cultural influence is only as strong as the respect people hold for the source of that culture. When political systems fracture, when inequality deepens, when promises of opportunity no longer match the lived reality of ordinary citizens, culture becomes less about aspiration and more about disillusionment. People begin to look elsewhere for inspiration. The illusion of cultural permanence is shattered when influence becomes tied more to nostalgia than to innovation. Others are now creating their own narratives, their own digital platforms, their own entertainment industries that resonate more authentically with their populations. Cultural monopoly was never eternal. It only lasted as long as people believed in its uniqueness. The illusion of endless power has also bred arrogance. Instead of adapting quickly to global changes, Western systems often double down on their established models, assuming that others will eventually be forced to return to the fold. This is a dangerous miscalculation. The speed of change in technology, demographics, and geopolitics means that by the time adjustments are considered, the gap has already widened. Arrogance convinces leaders that they are still ahead, even when evidence shows otherwise. Arrogance leads to sanctions that push countries to build parallel systems, to wars that drain resources, and to trade policies that isolate instead of integrate. The illusion is sustained by the belief that the rest of the world has no choice but to follow. But in truth, alternatives are multiplying in silence, preparing to stand on their own without needing approval. Perhaps the deepest illusion lies in the belief that time itself is on the West side. The assumption is that even if problems exist, they can be managed indefinitely because the foundation is too strong to collapse. But time is never neutral. Every year that passes without reform, every crisis that is postponed instead of solved, every institution that loses credibility accelerates the decline. Time erodes the illusion by exposing contradictions, the promise of equality against the reality of inequality, the rhetoric of democracy against the paralysis of political gridlock, the projection of strength against the reality of exhaustion. Believing that time will always favor the status quo is the final illusion, because time is the most ruthless force of all. It dismantles what looks indestructible, not with sudden destruction, but with gradual erosion that leaders often fail to notice until it is too late. The West's illusion of endless power was built on real achievements, but achievements do not guarantee eternal relevance. The belief that no replacement is possible ignores the lessons of history, where every dominant power was eventually surpassed. The illusion comforts those who fear change, but it blinds them to reality. The cracks are already visible. Financial dominance questioned, military superiority challenged by new forms of warfare, cultural leadership diluted, and political unity fractured from within. Yet the belief in endless power remains, perhaps because admitting its fragility would require the humility to change. And it is this refusal to face the fragility that accelerates the decline, because illusions are not broken by choice. They are shattered by reality when denial can no longer hold. The defining challenge of this era is not direct confrontation, but the quiet emergence of uncontrollable alternatives. For decades, the global order has been built around a framework designed and maintained by Western powers. Financial networks, technology standards, and trade routes all seem to operate under one rulebook. But history has entered a stage where parallel systems are no longer theoretical. They are already taking shape, and each passing year makes them stronger. The West may still believe it can dictate the terms of engagement, but the reality is that its grip on monopoly is slipping because other nations, other regions, and even private actors have found ways to operate without seeking permission. What was once unthinkable, conducting business, trade, and innovation, outside the established system, has now become inevitable. Consider global trade. For generations, the West defined the flows of energy, commodities, and goods, dictating the terms through financial leverage and naval presence. But today, new routes are being carved, both literally and figuratively. Energy deals that bypass Western intermediaries are increasing, with producers and consumers directly negotiating terms in their own currencies. This creates a chain reaction. Once one successful alternative is demonstrated, others quickly follow. The old assumption that every barrel of oil, every ton of metal, and every shipment of goods must clear Western approval is being dismantled piece by piece. It is not rebellion. It is reinvention. Countries that once depended on the Western system for access now realize they can construct their own platforms of trade. Financial systems tell a similar story. The dominance of one global currency enforced through institutions designed to maintain it, gave the West an extraordinary advantage. Sanctions became weapons, access to liquidity became a tool of leverage, and debt could be endlessly exported to sustain domestic consumption. Yet sanctions, intended as instruments of control, have ironically accelerated the search for alternatives. Nations, once intimidated by financial isolation, began building new clearinghouses, local currency agreements, and regional banking systems. The message is simple. If reliance on one system creates vulnerability, then resilience demands creating another. What once seemed impossible, the idea of trading energy or technology outside the established reserve currency, has already been tested and proven viable. This is not theory, but practice. And each successful transaction chips away at the monopoly that sustained Western dominance. Technology, once an uncontested domain of the West, is also witnessing a fundamental shift. For decades, it seemed that all significant breakthroughs, whether in computing, telecommunications, or biotechnology, emerged from Western laboratories and corporations. The rest of the world was seen as consumers, not creators. But today, nations once dismissed as mere participants in the global supply chain are becoming innovators in their own right. Alternative platforms to Western technology giants are no longer small experiments. They are massive ecosystems with billions of users, built to serve not just domestic needs, but global markets. New digital payment systems, alternative app ecosystems, and independent hardware supply chains are growing in strength. Once these ecosystems reach critical mass, they become uncontrollable alternatives. Too big to shut down, too resilient to isolate, and too deeply embedded to ignore. Energy, too, plays a central role in the rise of alternatives. For much of modern history, energy security meant aligning with the West's system of exploration, extraction, and distribution. The assumption was that access to energy flowed through Western-controlled finance and security arrangements. But in recent years, alternative energy corridors have emerged. Pipelines that bypass traditional choke points, shipping routes that avoid naval patrols, and renewable energy initiatives that reduce dependence altogether. Solar, wind, and nuclear investments in non-Western nations are creating domestic security that does not require external approval. When nations learn that they can power their industries without being bound to a centralized network, the leverage of that network collapses. Energy independence becomes the foundation for political independence. And political independence fuels the courage to reject old hierarchies. What makes these alternatives so dangerous to the established system is that they are not coordinated under one banner. They do not require a central leader or alliance. Instead, they emerge organically, driven by necessity, technology, and opportunity. A financial deal between two nations here, a technology breakthrough there, a cultural export from another region, all contribute to an ecosystem where no single authority can impose control. This decentralization makes it impossible to contain. Attempts to suppress one alternative only accelerate the creation of another. In this sense, the rise of uncontrollable alternatives is not a single confrontation, but 1,000 small revolutions happening simultaneously, each eroding a different part of the old monopoly culture, reflects this shift as well. Western media once dominated the imagination of billions, shaping what people wore, watched, and aspired to. But cultural alternatives have now reached maturity. Music industries in Asia, film industries in Africa, and digital platforms in Latin America are not merely copying Western forms. They are setting global trends. Young people no longer look to a single region for inspiration. They find authenticity in voices closer to home. Once cultural imagination is liberated, the ability of any single power to dominate narratives collapses. These alternatives are not only uncontrollable, they are unstoppable, because they resonate with local pride and global curiosity. The most striking aspect of these alternatives is their resilience. They may not begin as strong as the established system, but they learn to adapt. They are born out of necessity, which means they are designed to survive pressure. Sanctions push countries to refine their alternative financial networks. Exclusion from certain technologies accelerates domestic innovation. Attempts to isolate often produce the opposite effect: solidarity among those excluded. The very strategies once used to enforce dominance now inadvertently strengthen the alternatives, because they force innovation under pressure. What emerges from that process is often leaner, more adaptable, and less vulnerable to disruption. The illusion of control breaks down in the face of these uncontrollable alternatives. The old system cannot eliminate them because each alternative represents not just a structure, but a mindset. The mindset that dependency is a choice, not a fate. Once that mindset spreads, the system that thrived on dependency loses its foundation. The West can no longer assume that others will eventually return to its orbit, because the new orbit is already being drawn. These alternatives do not wait for permission. They thrive precisely because they no longer ask for it. And every day they grow stronger. The old monopoly looks less like inevitability and more like a fading memory. The greatest threat to enduring power has never been an external rival, but the fractures that appear within. For centuries, civilizations that seemed untouchable fell not because they were conquered from the outside, but because they eroded from the inside. The West today faces this same reality, though it rarely admits it openly. The divisions tearing through its societies are not loud battles fought on foreign fields, but quiet rifts spreading across its institutions, politics, and culture. These rifts weaken the very foundation of influence. While strategies often focus on managing external challenges, new alliances forming elsewhere, economic competition, technological rivalry, the deeper danger lies at home, in the inability to maintain unity, trust, and coherence within its own borders. Political polarization has reached levels that make consensus nearly impossible. In democracies once admired for their stability, gridlock has become routine, and governance is increasingly defined by short-term battles instead of long-term vision. Citizens see leaders fighting over ideology while infrastructure crumbles, education stagnates, and healthcare becomes more inaccessible. Each election cycle intensifies division rather than healing it. The system designed to give voice to diverse perspectives now amplifies hostility, rewarding those who sow conflict rather than those who build solutions. This paralysis is not only a domestic issue, it projects weakness globally. Rivals watch these divisions and understand that a society consumed by internal fights cannot lead the world with the same authority it once commanded. Economic inequality deepens the divide further. Wealth and opportunity are increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few, while large segments of the population feel excluded from progress. The promise that hard work and merit can secure a better life is losing credibility. When young people feel priced out of housing, when wages stagnate while profits soar, when entire communities are left behind by globalization, trust in the system collapses. Economic inequality does not simply mean different incomes. It means different realities. Those at the top live in a world of abundance and stability, while those below face uncertainty, insecurity, and frustration. This imbalance becomes fertile ground for anger, populism, and social unrest. The silent enemy thrives here, feeding resentment that weakens the unity of the nation. Institutions, once respected as the pillars of order, are also losing credibility. Trust in government, media, corporations, and even education has been steadily declining. Scandals, corruption, misinformation, and broken promises have created a culture of skepticism. People no longer believe institutions work for them. They believe they work against them. When institutions lose legitimacy, They cannot mobilize society toward common goals. Citizens disengage or rebel, leaving leadership fragmented and ineffective. In this environment, external rivals hardly need to intervene. Internal collapse is already set in motion by disillusionment and distrust. The cultural divide intensifies these fractures. Generational gaps widen as younger people demand change on issues like climate, social justice, and technology, while older generations resist, clinging to traditions that no longer resonate. This generational tension becomes more than just disagreement. It turns into identity conflict. Immigration, diversity, and globalization bring new cultures into societies that once defined themselves by a singular identity. And instead of adapting smoothly, many nations are struggling with backlash, xenophobia, and isolationism. What should have been a strength, diverse perspectives, skills, and ideas, becomes a battlefield where unity is sacrificed to fear. The inability to integrate differences constructively allows division to metastasize into hostility. Media and technology, once celebrated for their ability to connect people, now deepen division by creating echo chambers. Algorithms feed citizens content that reinforces their beliefs, isolating them from opposing perspectives. Instead of dialogue, there is outrage. Instead of shared understanding, there is fragmentation. When people cannot even agree on basic facts, when truth itself is fractured into competing narratives, governance and collaboration collapse, the silent enemy grows stronger, not because the population is weak, but because it is divided into smaller and smaller groups that no longer see themselves as part of the same whole. The consequences of these divisions ripple outward into global influence. A society that cannot agree within itself cannot act decisively abroad. Foreign policy becomes inconsistent, shifting with every election or internal crisis. Allies lose confidence, rivals gain boldness, and global leadership wanes. External competitors do not need to overpower the West directly. They only need to wait and watch as internal division paralyzes it from within. Power is not only about military or financial dominance, it is about cohesion. And cohesion is exactly what is fading fastest. History offers countless reminders of this pattern. The Roman Empire fractured under internal corruption and inequality long before barbarian invasions. The Ottoman Empire collapsed after centuries of internal stagnation and infighting. The Soviet Union disintegrated, not solely because of external pressure, but because of its inability to sustain trust and unity within. In each case, external challengers merely delivered the final blow. The real collapse came from the silent enemy of division that hollowed out the system from the inside. The West stands at risk of repeating this cycle, not because it lacks resources or technology, but because it cannot overcome its own internal fragmentation. The most dangerous aspect of internal division is that it is often invisible until it is too late. Leaders believe they are managing temporary challenges, when in reality, those challenges are symptoms of deeper fractures. Citizens assume the system will eventually correct itself, even as their trust continues to erode. The silent enemy advances quietly, without the noise of open war. But with the certainty of decay, a society consumed by division is like a building eaten by termites. It may look stable from the outside, but inside its foundations are being eaten away, and collapse can come suddenly, without warning. The West's external rivals understand this vulnerability well. They do not always need to outcompete in technology, finance, or military terms. They only need to exploit the divisions already present. Cyber campaigns target trust in institutions. Propaganda amplifies existing grievances. Trade disputes pit regions and industries against each other. The battlefield is not a distant land, but the very fabric of society. And when societies turn on themselves, when neighbors see each other as enemies, No external adversary is required to achieve victory. The silent enemy has already done the work. The most limited resource for any civilization is not money, not energy, not even natural resources. It is time. For decades, the West assumed that time was its ally. That even when mistakes were made or challenges arose, there would always be enough space to correct course. This assumption created a dangerous complacency. Every crisis was managed with temporary fixes rather than long-term solutions. Every flaw was patched rather than restructured, and every warning was postponed rather than acted upon. But time does not wait for indecision. The world moves forward whether one is ready or not. And while the West debated, delayed, and resisted change, the clock continued ticking. Now, the window for reinvention is shrinking rapidly, and the options available are fewer with each passing year. Reinvention demands humility. It requires admitting that old models of dominance no longer function in a world that is multipolar, interconnected, and driven by rapid innovation. For too long, leaders clung to the illusion that the structures built in the 20th century would continue to guarantee security and influence in the 21st. Global institutions, financial frameworks, and military alliances that once ensured control are increasingly outdated, yet they are treated as untouchable. This refusal to acknowledge obsolescence consumes precious time. Every moment spent defending the past instead of building for the future makes the challenge of reinvention harder. Time punishes arrogance because it magnifies missed opportunities into irreversible decline. The economic model is one of the clearest examples of this shrinking timeline. The West grew used to financing its prosperity through debt, consumption, and the privilege of controlling the world's dominant currency. But this system is no longer sustainable in the face of rising competitors who are creating alternatives and in the reality of domestic populations losing faith in economic fairness. Reinvention would mean restructuring economies to balance growth with sustainability, innovation with equality, and debt with productivity. Yet instead of bold reform, politics often defaults to short-term solutions, stimulus packages, monetary easing, or temporary subsidies. These may calm markets in the moment, but do nothing to address structural weaknesses. Time exposes these weaknesses relentlessly. And with each cycle of crisis and patchwork, the system becomes more fragile. The longer true reform is delayed, the less room remains for reinvention. Politically, the cost of delaying reinvention is even higher. Democracies that cannot build consensus drift into paralysis. Authoritarian tendencies rise in the vacuum of ineffective leadership. Trust in government erodes when citizens see endless debates, but little change in their daily realities. Reinvention here would mean rethinking how institutions function, creating systems that are more transparent, more accountable, and more adaptable to modern challenges. Yet, the reality is that politics remains chained to partisanship, to the endless struggle for power, rather than the responsibility of governance. While leaders fight over ideology, time quietly reduces the margin for error. The longer this dysfunction continues, the harder it becomes to restore trust. A society that wastes its time on division instead of reinvention eventually runs out of the unity needed to reinvent at all. Technology, too, is an arena where time punishes hesitation. The pace of innovation has become exponential, and those who adapt early gain advantages that compound over time. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and energy breakthroughs are reshaping industries. But hesitation and fear of disruption hold back bold action. Reinvention requires investment, not just in research, but in the ecosystems that allow innovation to thrive: education, infrastructure, and forward-thinking regulation. Instead, societies often become trapped between outdated regulatory models and corporate monopolies resistant to change. Time does not forgive hesitation in technology. Every year of delay widens the gap, and once a competitor secures leadership in a new field, catching up may become impossible. Reinvention delayed is leadership surrendered. Culturally, reinvention is equally urgent. Societies that once set the tone for global aspiration are now struggling to define their identity. The West's cultural dominance, built on creativity, openness, and innovation, risks being overshadowed by internal division, cynicism, and nostalgia. Reinvention here means rediscovering the values that once inspired the world, not as empty slogans, but as lived realities. It means embracing diversity not as a threat, but as strength. Creating narratives that resonate with younger generations who no longer see themselves reflected in outdated institutions. Yet culture, like trust, cannot be rebuilt overnight. It requires years of investment, imagination, and authenticity. Time is cruel in this arena as well, because every year that culture drifts further from innovation and inclusivity, others fill the gap with their own stories, their own creativity, and their own platforms. Globally, reinvention requires letting go of the idea of dominance and embracing interdependence. The 20th century was defined by the West shaping the rules, but the 21st is defined by a world where power is distributed across multiple centers. Reinvention here means building partnerships that are based on equality rather than hierarchy, on collaboration rather than control. It means recognizing that influence in a multipolar world is earned, not assumed. Yet instead of reinvention, many policies cling to the old framework of competition and containment. This only accelerates isolation as others build networks and alliances that operate independently. Time erodes the privilege of setting the rules, and once alternative systems mature, reintegration becomes far more difficult. The most dangerous assumption is that there will always be more time. This belief creates the illusion that reinvention can be postponed without consequence. But time is not neutral. Time compounds problems, hardens divisions, and strengthens competitors. Every delay makes reinvention more painful because the gap between what is needed and what is possible widens. Nations that fail to act decisively eventually reach a point where reinvention is no longer a choice, but a desperate reaction, often too little and too late. The West is approaching this threshold, where the luxury of gradual reform is giving way to the urgency of survival. Time does not simply pass. It narrows the range of possible futures. The truth is that reinvention is not optional. It is the only path left to avoid irrelevance. But reinvention requires courage, vision, and sacrifice, qualities that are often in short supply when societies are consumed by division and nostalgia. The clock continues to move forward, indifferent to debates and denial. Each tick represents lost opportunity. Each passing year reduces the room for maneuver. The longer reinvention is delayed, the narrower the options become, until finally the illusion of choice vanishes altogether.